Salutations! I am D, and Samhain Month is still going. Howard Phillips H.P. Lovecraft, a writer of horror, fantasy, sci-fi, or what he personally likes to call weird fiction. His stories can be described as... Know what? Why won't I let Lovecraft himself explain it?
I am a writer of tales of the uncanny. I suppose my work is intended to fill the gap science has left in the place which was occupied in years past by religion.
He more than succeeded at that. But enough about Cthulhu. Let's talk about his other notorious character, Herbert West. Herbert West is the prototypical mad scientist, obsessed with trying to bring dead things back to life. Which, to us modern audiences, doesn't sound that new, I freely confess. However, the movie that started this trend was made in 1968, the movie it ripped off was made in 1964, and the book that was based on was published in 1954. And if you knew that Lovecraft died in 1937, well, you can put two and two together. And of course, like any great and or notorious story, it needs a movie to go with it. That movie being Reanimator from 1985. An interesting and certainly memorable story told in two ways. But which one does it best? Let's find out. This is H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator versus Reanimator. Let us begin with... Yeah, I already hit something of a snag. The movie calls him Dan Kane, but in the story he's just a nameless narrator. Let's keep it simple and call him Dan Kane anyway. He's a med student at the Miskatonic University in Arkham. What's that? You don't know where to find Arkham? Why, it's right next to Derry. Just ask the local clown for directions. Anyway, in the original story, he's just someone who's become fascinated with West's research. I dare even say he becomes just as obsessed about this entire ordeal, and therefore assists West in every which way he can. Whereas in the movie, he's a bit more of a reluctant assistant, who gets nervous at every inconvenient moment. Still, his loyalty is not without its motivation, seeing as he was getting sick of patients dying on him. So yeah, I like how he's more fleshed out in the movie. But then again, anyone who's seen the movie, how much time do you think went by in there? A week? 2 at the most? I think that's about right. In the story, however, the awesome quest had begun when West and I were students at the Miskatonic University Medical School in Arkham, vividly conscious for the first time of the thoroughly mechanical nature of life. That was 7 years before. 7 years? Wait, when does all this take place? So on the night of July 18th, 1910. 1910, good to know. In 1915, I was a physician with the rank of first lieutenant. Wow. I thought 7 years was a long time, but 5 additional years? For these guys to stick together for so long, it almost makes Kane just as guilty as West for everything that happened, which makes him a little more interesting in the story than in the movie. So that's it for this character. Next we have Megan Halsey, a character that wasn't in the original story, so they had to make her up for the movie. Now I can think of 2 reasons why they created her. 1. Lovecraft rarely, if ever, mentions any women in his works, so she had to be created to allow for some gender diversity. The second reason is to up the ante a little. I can now hear feminists say something along the lines of, "Ooh, they have to have a damsel in distress, don't they?" Well, that's one way to look at it. But the way I see it, it's more about having a direct connection to the world around them. You see, in the original story, some of the dead people they reanimated escape their grasp and roll around freely, in which case their experiments do not affect our anti-heroes directly. However, since Megan is betrothed to one of them, and she gets involved in the whole thing, it allows for the characters to directly witness how their actions affect the world around them. How they, as it were, end up hurting the people they love. Or rather, how one of them ends up hurting someone he loves, as the other... Well, we'll get to him in due time. First, let us discuss the head and the body. This one is particularly funny. In the original story, the head and the body once belonged to a man named Eric Moreland Clapman Lee. In the movie, his name's Carl Hill. Additionally, Moreland was a soldier, while Hill was a doctor. On top of that, they may fulfill the same slot of the de facto villain, but both had different motivations for what they did. Moreland, for starters. It's possible he was alright with being brought back from the dead, but I can imagine he'd rather have his head still attached to his body. So revenge is the obvious motivator. As for Hill, he's a doctor, who not only covets Megan, but also wants to take credit for West's work.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head?
That's a legitimate question. I mean, since this guy lives despite his decapitation, it allows for some credibility. But on the other hand, it also gives him an obvious handicap. And let's face it, handicapped people are rarely taken seriously. So yeah, would anyone believe him? No matter. We finally arrived at our eponymous Reanimator, Herbert West. Now, comparing West in the story with West in the movie is a bit unfair. Why? Well, get this. Every now and then he applied his stethoscope to the specimen and bore the negative results philosophically. After about 3/4 of an hour, without the least sign of life, he disappointedly pronounced the solution inadequate. And for 17 years after that, West would look frequently over his shoulder and complain of fancied footsteps behind him. And that's about it. The narrator doesn't hint or describe West as eccentric and paranoid, he almost just blatantly tells us he's eccentric and paranoid. Which works better in the movie. You never hear anyone say that Herbert West is eccentric, they just show you. Which is a lot more fun. I especially like this scene.
Oh, Dad! What are you doing in my room?
Oh,
How dare you come
Dad!
in my room?
Dad!
What's the matter? I thought I was renting a private room, Dan.
So he kills their cat, keeps it in his fridge, and yet he makes them seem like bad guys? Damn. Anyway, to paraphrase Rowan Atkinson, all these characters amount to nothing whatsoever without the plot. In his experiments with various animating solutions, he had killed and treated immense number of rabbits, guinea pigs, cats, dogs, and monkeys, till he had become the prime nuisance of the college. In the radical theory of reanimation, they saw nothing but the immature vagaries of a youthful enthusiast whose slight form gave no hint of the supernormal, almost diabolical, power of the cold brain within. This strikes me as a little odd. I mean, in being doctors, they swore an oath to preserve human life. So you'd think they'd be all for this reanimation experiment. In the movie, on the other hand, he had already conducted an experiment on a human, which, as you can see, didn't go very well, thereby giving the scientific community a reason to be suspicious of all his activities. Also, while the story merely mentions experiments on animals, we actually get to see one of these experiments. Remember that dead cat from before? Well, West reanimates the little critter, and you can see where this is going.
What the hell is it? Later! Later!
Well, I don't see a cat, but I do see a shadow. Even showing stuff isn't without its disadvantages. Oh well. Better wrap this up. Both versions are obvious products of their time. One was written while we knew very little about the world around us. The other was made when we knew more. One was written when we didn't know too many stories like that. The other was made when we've seen too many movies like that. In the end, it all comes down to what you like best. Simple but creative? Or more fleshed out, but risky? Still, which one's superior? Well, if I have to choose right now, I'd go with the movie.